Part IV. Place Names. The Name. Section 1. Among the rooms which used most commonly to take shape in my mind during my long nights of sleeplessness, there was none that differed more utterly from the rooms at Cambrai, thickly powdered with the motes of an atmosphere granular, pollenous, edible, and instinct with piety, than my room in the Grand Hôtel de la Plage at Baalbec, the walls of which, washed with ripolene, contain, like the polished sides of a basin in which the water glows with a blue, lurking fire, a finer air, pure, azure tinted, saline. The Bavarian upholsterer who had been entrusted with the furnishing of this hotel had varied his scheme of decoration in different rooms, and in that which I found myself occupying had set against the walls, on three sides of it, a series of low bookcases with glass fronts, in which, according to where they stood, by a law of nature which he had perhaps forgotten to take into account, was reflected this or that section of the ever-changing view of the sea, so that the walls were lined with a frieze of seascapes, interrupted only by the polished mahogany of the actual shelves. And so effective was this, that the whole room had the appearance of one of those model bedrooms which you see nowadays in housing exhibitions, decorated with works of art which are calculated by their designer to refresh the eyes of whoever may ultimately have to sleep in the rooms, the subjects being kept in some degree of harmony with the locality and surroundings of the houses for which the rooms are planned. And yet nothing could have differed more utterly, either, from the real Baalbec than that other Baalbec of which I had often dreamed, on stormy days, when the wind was so strong that Françoise, as she took me to the Champs Elysées, would warn me not to walk too near the side of the street, or I might have my head knocked off by a falling slate, and would recount to me, with many lamentations, the terrible disasters and shipwrecks that were reported in the newspaper. I longed for nothing more than to behold a storm at sea, less as a mighty spectacle than as a momentary revelation of the true life of nature. Or rather, there were for me no mighty spectacles, save those which I knew to be not artificially composed for my entertainment, but necessary and unalterable, the beauty of landscapes or of great works of art. I was not curious. I did not thirst to know anything save what I believed to be more genuine than myself, what had for me the supreme merit of showing me a fragment of the mind of a great genius, or of the force or the grace of nature as she appeared when left entirely to herself, without human interference. Just as the lovely sound of her voice, reproduced all by itself upon the phonograph, could never console a man for the loss of his mother, so a mechanical imitation of a storm would have left me as cold as did the illuminated fountains at the exhibition. I required also, if the storm was to be absolutely genuine, that the shore from which I watched it should be a natural shore, not an embankment recently constructed by a municipality. Besides, nature, by all the feelings that she aroused in me, seemed to me the most opposite thing in the world to the mechanical inventions of mankind. The less she bore their imprint, the more room she offered for the expansion of my heart. And, as it happened, I had preserved the name of Baalbec, which Le Grandin had cited to us as that of a seaside place in the very midst of that funereal coast, famed for the number of its wrecks, swathed for 6 months in the year in a shroud of fog and flying foam from the waves. You feel there, below your feet still, he had told me, far more even than at Finisterre, and even though hotels are now being superimposed upon it, without power, however, to modify that oldest bone in the earth's skeleton. You feel there that you are actually at the Land's End of France, of Europe, of the Old World. And it is the ultimate encampment of the fishermen, precisely like the fishermen who have lived since the world's beginning, facing the everlasting kingdom of the sea fogs and shadows of the night. One day when at Cambrai I had spoken of this coast, this Baalbec, before M. Swann, hoping to learn from him whether it was the best point to select for seeing the most violent storms, he had replied, "I should think I did know Baalbec. The church at Baalbec, built in the 12th and 13th century, and still half Romanesque, is perhaps the most curious example to be found of our Norman Gothic, and so exceptional that one is tempted to describe it as Persian in its inspiration. And that region, which, until then, had seemed to me to be nothing else than a part of immemorial nature, that had remained contemporaneous with the great phenomena of geology, and as remote from human history as the ocean itself or the Great Bear, with its wild race of fishermen, for whom, no more than for their whales, had there been any Middle Ages, it had been a great joy to me to see it suddenly take its place in the order of the centuries, with a stored consciousness of the Romanesque epoch, and to know that the Gothic trefoil had come to diversify those wild rocks also, at the appointed hour, like those frail but hardy plants which in the polar regions, when the spring returns, scatter their stars about the eternal snows. And if Gothic art brought to those places and people a classification which otherwise they lacked, they too conferred one upon it in return. I tried to form a picture in my mind of how those fishermen had lived, the timid and unsuspected essay towards social intercourse which they had attempted there, clustered upon a promontory of the shores of hell, at the foot of the cliffs of death. And Gothic art seemed to me a more living thing now that, detaching it from the towns in which until then I had always imagined it, I could see how, in a particular instance, upon a reef of savage rocks, it had taken root and grown until it flowered in a tapering spire. I was taken to see reproductions of the most famous of the statues at Baalbek, shaggy, blunt-faced apostles, the Virgin from the porch, and I could scarcely breathe for joy at the thought that I might myself, one day, see them take a solid form against their eternal background of salt fog. Thereafter, on dear tempestuous February nights, the wind, breathing into my heart, which it shook no less violently than the chimney of my bedroom, the project of a visit to Baalbek, blended in me the desire for Gothic architecture with that for a storm upon the sea. I should have liked to take, the very next day, the good, the generous train at 1:22, of which never without a palpitating heart could I read, in the railway company's bills, or in advertisements of circular tours, the hour of departure. It seemed to me to cut, at a precise point in every afternoon, a most fascinating groove, a mysterious mark, from which the diverted hours still led one on, of course, towards evening, towards to-morrow morning, but to an evening and morning which one would behold, not in Paris, but in one of those towns through which the train passed, and among which it allowed one to choose. For it stopped at Bayeux, at Coutances, at Vitres, at Questembert, at Pontorson, at Baalbek, at Lannion, at Lamballe, at Benaudet, at Pont-Aven, at Quimper, and progressed magnificently surcharged with names which it offered me, so that among them all I did not know which to choose, so impossible was it to sacrifice any. But even without waiting for the train next day, I could, by rising and dressing myself with all speed, leave Paris that very evening, should my parents permit, and arrive at Baalbek as dawn spread westward over the raging sea, from whose driven foam I would seek shelter in that church in the Persian manner. But at the approach of the Easter holidays, when my parents had promised to let me spend them for once in the north of Italy, lo, in place of those dreams of tempests, by which I had been entirely possessed, not wishing to see anything but waves dashing in from all sides, mounting always higher, upon the wildest of coasts, beside churches as rugged and precipitous as cliffs, in whose towers the sea-birds would be wailing, suddenly, effacing them, taking away all their charm, excluding them because they were its opposite and could only have weakened its effect, was substituted in me the converse dream of the most variegated of springs. Not the spring of Combray, still pricking with all the needle points of the winter's frost, but that which already covered with lilies and anemones the meadows of Fiesole, and gave Florence a dazzling golden background like those in Fra Angelico's pictures. From that moment only sunlight, perfumes, colors, seemed to me to have any value, for this alternation of images had effected a change of front in my desire, and, as abrupt as those that occur sometimes in music, a complete change of tone in my sensibility. Thus it came about that a mere atmospheric variation would be sufficient to provoke in me that modulation, without there being any need for me to await the return of a season. For often we find a day in one that has strayed from another season, and makes us live in that other, summons at once into our presence, and makes us long for its peculiar pleasures, and interrupts the dreams that we were in process of weaving by inserting out of its turn, too early or too late, this leaf, torn from another chapter, in the interpolated calendar of happiness. But soon it happened that, like those natural phenomena from which our comfort or our health can derive but an accidental and all too modest benefit, until the day when science takes control of them and, producing them at will, places in our hands the power to order their appearance, withdrawn from the tutelage and independent of the consent of chance. Similarly, the production of these dreams of the Atlantic and of Italy cease to depend entirely upon the changes of the seasons and of the weather. I need only to make them reappear pronounce the names, Baalbec, Venice, Florence, within whose syllables had gradually accumulated all the longing inspired in me by the places for which they stood. Even in spring, to come in a book upon the name of Baalbec sufficed to awaken in me the desire for storms at sea and for the Norman Gothic. Even on a stormy day, the name of Florence or of Venice would awaken the desire for sunshine, for lilies, for the Palace of the Doges, and for Santa Maria del Fiore. But if their names thus permanently absorbed the image that I had formed of these towns, it was only by transforming that image, by subordinating its reappearance in me to their own special laws, and in consequence of this they made it more beautiful, but at the same time more different from anything that the towns of Normandy or Tuscany could in reality be, and, by increasing the arbitrary delights of my imagination, aggravated the disenchantment that was in store for me when I set out upon my travels. They magnified the idea that I formed of certain points on the earth's surface, making them more special, and in consequence more real. I did not then represent to myself towns, landscapes, historic buildings, as pictures more or less attractive, cut out here and there of a substance that was common to them all, but looked on each of them as on an unknown thing, different from all the rest, a thing for which my soul was athirst, by the knowledge of which it would benefit. How much more individual still was the character that they assumed from being designated by names, names that were only for themselves, proper names such as people have. Words present to us little pictures of things, lucid and normal, like the pictures that are hung on the walls of schoolrooms to give children an illustration of what is meant by a carpenter's bench, a bird, an ant hill, things chosen as typical of everything else of the same sort. But names present to us, of persons and of towns which they accustom us to regard as individual, as unique, like persons, a confused picture, which draws from the names, from the brightness or darkness of their sound, the color in which it is uniformly painted, like one of those posters, entirely blue or entirely red, in which, on account of the limitations imposed by the process used in their reproduction, or by a whim on the designer's part, are blue or red not only the sky and the sea, but the ships and the church and the people in the streets. The name of Parma, one of the towns that I most longed to visit after reading the Chartreuse, seeming to me compact and glossy, violet tinted, soft, if any one were to speak of such or such a house in Parma in which I should be lodged, he would give me the pleasure of thinking that I was to inhabit a dwelling that was compact and glossy, violet tinted, soft, and that bore no relation to the houses in any other town in Italy, since I could imagine it only by the aid of that heavy syllable of the name of Parma, in which no breath of air stirred, and of all that I had made it assume of Stendhalian sweetness and the reflected hue of violets. And when I thought of Florence, it was of a town miraculously embalmed and flower-like, since it was called the City of the Lilies, and its cathedral, Our Lady of the Flower. As for Baalbec, it was one of those names in which, as on any old piece of Norman pottery that still keeps the color of the earth from which it was fashioned, one sees depicted still the representation of some long abolished custom, of some feudal rite, of the former condition of some place, of an obsolete way of pronouncing the language which had shaped and wedded its incongruous syllables, and which I never doubted that I should find spoken there at once, even by the innkeeper who would pour me out coffee and milk on my arrival, taking me down to watch the turbulent sea, unchained, before the church, to whom I lent the aspect, disputatious, solemn, and medieval, of some character in one of the old romances. Had my health definitely improved, had my parents allowed me, if not actually to go down to stay at Balbec, at least to take, just once, so as to become acquainted with the architecture and landscapes of Normandy or of Brittany, that 1:22 train into which I had so often clamored in imagination, I should have preferred to stop, and to alight from it at the most beautiful of its towns. But in vain might I compare and contrast them. How was one to choose, any more than between individual people who are not interchangeable, between Bayeux, so lofty in its noble coronet of rusty lace, whose highest point caught the light of the old gold of its second syllable; Vitre, whose acute accent barred in ancient glass with wooden lozenges; gentle Lamballe, whose whiteness ranged from egg‐shell yellow to a pearly gray; Coutances, a Norman cathedral, which its final consonants, rich and yellowing, crowned with a tower of butter; Lannion, with the rumble and buzz, in the silence of its village street, of the fly on the wheel of the coach; Questembert, Pontorson, ridiculously silly and simple, white feathers and yellow beaks strewn along the road to those well-watered and poetic spots; Benaudet, a name scarcely moored that seemed to be striving to draw the river down into the tangle of its seaweed; Pont Aven, the snowy, rosy flight of the wing of a lightly poised coif, tremulously reflected in the greenish waters of a canal; Quimperle, more firmly attached this, and since the Middle Ages among the rivulets with which it babbled, threading their pearls upon a gray background, like the pattern made, through the cobwebs upon a window, by rays of sunlight changed into blunt points of tarnished silver? End of Part 4, Section 1.